Good morning to everyone from IISS in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much for tuning in for what promises to be an interesting webinar. The topic today is COVID-19 and organized crime in the Western Balkans. My name is Benjamin Peclini. I'm a research fellow at IISS in the Conflict, Security and Development Program, a research program that monitors armed conflicts and domestic instability at the global level and analyzes the implications on countries' development trajectories and on international security. Our team curates the IISS yearly flagship publication on armed conflict survey, which most of you are probably familiar with. It is a pleasure to welcome you today to this online conversation to talk about the evolution of organized crime in the Western Balkan region in light of COVID-19 and the policy and operational responses to it. This webinar emanates from a paper on the impact of COVID-19 on organized crime in the Western Balkans, paper that benefited from the support of PMI Impact. Organized crime is a long-standing challenge in the Western Balkans, which obviously predates COVID-19. According to the OECD, illicit economies globally amount to between 2 and 5.5% of global GDP. Organized crime has domestic implications on the rule of law, on institutions and on governance reform, and it represents a huge obstacle to economic development. No single challenge can be taken in isolation though, as it is the interplay between all these different dynamics that matters. The interplay between crime and security, corruption and governance, and illicit economies and transnational crime. Organized crime is also a critical issue that has strategic and regional implications, including on the relationship with the European Union, as 4 of the 6 countries in the Western Balkans have embarked on the process of EU accession. For the sake of everyone's clarity, with Western Balkans, we are noting the following 6 Balkan countries that are not EU members: Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kosovo, Montenegro, North Macedonia, and Serbia. For today's conversation, we have 2 main objectives. The first one is to discuss the landscape of organized crime in the region and the strategic implications as organized crime relates to governance and security in the region and to the EU accession process, as I mentioned. The second objective is to explore some of the opportunities going forward in terms of policy priorities and operational responses, as well as challenges. Specifically, can COVID-19 represent an opportunity for moving forward policies on criminal justice, corruption, and governance? And if yes, why and how? Or is it an obstacle? Second, what are the policy and operational priorities to counteract organized crime in the region? These are some of the questions that we will try to answer. Joining me to unpack these issues today, we have a distinguished panel of 4 experts and practitioners. In order of appearance, we have the pleasure to welcome the following speakers: Stefano Betti, who is the author of the main paper that I mentioned earlier. He wears several professional hats. He's an associate fellow in our Conflict, Security and Development Program at IISS. He's deputy director of the Transnational Alliance to Combat Illicit Trade, and also a senior advisor to the Syracuse International Institute for Criminal Justice and Human Rights. Tobias Freeman is Senior Legal Officer, also with the Syracuse International Institute for Criminal Justice and Human Rights, which is located in the beautiful city of Syracuse in Sicily, Italy. We have with us Virginia de Abaco Marquez, who is the Regional Advisor to Western Balkans with the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC, based in Belgrade, Serbia. And last but not least, we have Valentin Niculescu, who is Director of Operations of the Southeast European Law Enforcement Center, known as SELEC, which is based in Bucharest, Romania. Now, before we start, just some quick logistics and housekeeping rules. We will have a first round of remarks by the speakers for 5 to 7 minutes each, followed by some questions from the chair. We will then open it up for questions from the audience. Now, there are two ways to ask questions. You can either use the raise your hand function in Zoom at any moment and be put in line to ask your question directly when the time comes. Or you can type your question in the Q&A box on your screen and I will relate your question. Now, without further ado, let me turn to Stefano Betti for your initial remarks. Thank you.
Many thanks, Benjamin, for giving me the floor and for this opportunity. If you don't mind, I would like to say one thing up front that I think is very important. It is when we look at the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on organized crime dynamics, we see that overall, worldwide, that has been a very positive experience for organized criminal groups. So they've really managed to successfully exploit the situation pretty much anywhere in the world. And so when we focus on the Balkans, and there are many papers and many reports that focus on the Balkans, we are by no means suggesting that the pandemic is only creating opportunities for criminal groups in this region. No, this would definitely be a false impression. At the same time, it is true that the Western Balkans offer a really interesting case study because of the specific features of their territory, their geography, and their history. And so some of the things that we have observed in relation to the Balkans may perhaps illuminate some similar dynamics at play elsewhere in the world. So I would say if there is one overarching message that emerges from the paper that has been written by IISS, and which of course I invite you all to read, it is the following. Organized criminal groups prosper at times of crisis, whether these are triggered by a natural event or by a subprime mortgage crisis in the US, or a virus that jumps from animals to humans in an obscure Chinese market. So the thing is that almost immediately at the outset of the pandemic, it became clear that travel bans and border closures had not quite affected the ability of organized criminal groups to carry out, for example, smuggling operations in the Balkans. And this is sort of natural because after all, borders were still and are still open for commercial purposes. So drugs could and can still be hidden in trucks and mixed up with consumer goods, for example, and benefiting on various occasions with benefited from officials at border crossing points that are willing to turn a blind eye in exchange for a bribe. Smuggling of migrants. It's another issue in the region that has been changed a little bit with the onset of the pandemic. The region is a bridge between south and north, between east and west. Right? It's a natural transit point, not only for goods, but also for people. So how has the pandemic impacted the people smuggling business? If you read reports from Frontex, the European Union border agency, well, this agency recorded a sharp drop in individual migrants detected in attempts to illegally cross borders in these regions in the first months of the pandemic. But the point is that these data only concern official crossing points. So the question is how many migrants have and are being smuggled, exploiting the largely unpatrolled, rugged coastlines in the Balkans or using muddy paths in the mountainous inland. This is what Europol actually a few months ago had feared as a likely scenario. And I would add we know by experience that smuggling networks react to heightened risks of detection and to worsening operational conditions, not by going home, not by stopping their business, but by imposing higher smuggling fees. It would be interesting in this respect also to know if the representative of Select, we have the pleasure here to have, has any hints about the current situation on the ground. And then, of course, the sale of counterfeit or substandard masks, hand sanitizers, medical equipment, etc. These were really the first business opportunities that criminal groups in the Balkans, like elsewhere, by the way, were ready to jump on, prompted by the panic, the uncertainties in the population, the confusion, the contradictory messages sent around by local and international health authorities in a context where online transactions really supplanted those taking place offline. How about then organized crime and vaccines? We all know that in these days, governments, business associations, technology providers, they are all discussing the pros and cons of introducing vaccination passports. Well, let's not forget that already 1 year ago, at the start of the pandemic, a criminal group was arrested in Serbia for charging up to 800 euros to produce fake test certificates. It is thus not really surprising that 1 year later, the new criminal frontier has become the sale of vaccine on the black market. And currently, countries such as Kosovo, Bosnia, North Macedonia, but also others in the region, have hardly received any vaccination dose. When there is such a huge gap between legal demand and supply, it is actually inevitable for unscrupulous actors to start offering these products on the black market, and these are potentially health damaging products as well. So this prompts a series of questions. I don't have the answer, but I think these are questions to be asked. How secure are vaccine supply chains operating in the Balkans? How insulated are they from the risk of interference by criminal groups during transport, when these vaccines move from one intermediary to the other one, when they are stocked in hospitals? Overall, I think we can safely say that the pandemic has not changed really the way of pursuing criminal activities in the Balkans. Rather, it has exacerbated trends that were already at play before. It has emphasized the deep-seated fragilities affecting the region. Some of these fragilities, we know, are actually the legacy of the wars that have ravaged the region in the 90s. For example, at the time, contraband became an entrenched practice, but that at that time, it was a means of survival for communities under siege or for political regimes that were badly hit by international sanctions. So now the historical context has changed, but the practice has survived. Simply, it has been put at the service of different interests. Another example of a long-standing fragility in the region are the public procurement systems, which have long been recognized as one of the weakest parts of the Balkans public sectors. The pandemic has underlined again this vulnerability, and actually by adopting fast-track, simplified procurement procedures to ensure the urgent delivery of medical equipment to hospitals, by awarding public contracts outside of open and competitive tenders, countries have clearly made their system more susceptible to corruption, to nepotistic practices, and criminal infiltration. The paradigmatic and allow me also to say surreal example of this happening in Bosnia a few months ago where the contract for life-saving ventilators was even awarded to a raspberry producing company. So with this backdrop, I think the big question is whether this bonanza for criminals created by the pandemic is temporary and destined to subside once the crisis fades, once the crisis is over, or rather it is here to stay in the long term. Now, I don't have an answer to this question, to be honest, and I think nobody does. What we know, however, is that the health-related impacts of this crisis will at some point be over, hopefully within a few months, ideally. But the economic fallout will linger on. And faltering economies mean shrinking budgets, including for law enforcement and crime prevention purposes. So there is clearly a risk that this pandemic will trigger a downward spiral that emboldens criminal groups even more, and that outpaces law enforcement efforts. At the same time, this is not an inevitable outcome. And so perhaps a more relevant question to be asked is the following: can this crisis be used as a catalyst to better employ scarce, limited resources towards a few priority objectives in the fight against crime? And to mention just a few, confronting organized crime through more robust and systematic financial investigations, investing more in intelligence-driven approaches, addressing the smuggling of accessible goods such as tobacco and alcohol more vigorously as a way to recover badly needed tax revenues, just a few examples. And then my last point that I think is important. It would be, I think, naive and unfair to argue that the fight against Balkan-based organized criminal groups is the sole responsibility of Balkan countries. We're not just talking about street gangs that are satisfied with extorting money to local businesses here. And if you have read our paper, you will see that we mentioned the example of a Balkan-based organized criminal group that is really competing with some of the most aggressive and tentacular criminal organizations worldwide. For what? For the control of the entire cocaine supply chain, from the jungles of South America to the streets of Western Europe. So there is only, in a way, so much that Balkan countries can do by themselves to disrupt operations, including laundering operations, right, that are truly global in nature, although, of course, they carry a local imprint, which points to the importance of confronting Balkan-based organized criminal groups beyond the Balkans as well. So I will stop here with my remarks, and I look forward to also hearing the other speakers. Certainly they will have many interesting points to add. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Stefano. I'll give the floor right away to Tobias Freeman. Tobias, thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Peclini. Firstly, thank you so much to Dr. Irene Mia and the International Institute for the opportunity to be here with you today. Special thanks to Stefano, who has produced a very fine analysis of the wide variety of criminal justice, security, and geopolitical considerations at play in the Western Balkans and indeed interplaying in the sub-region. I'm going to pick up where Stefano left off and hopefully unpack in a little bit more detail the significance of Western Balkans organized criminal groups emerging on the global stage. Secondly, I want to get to the point of what Stefano mentioned at the end of his remarks, a question of priorities. So I want to offer some thoughts on what those priorities should be. Stefano rightly points to the fact that Western Balkans organized crime is changing its face fundamentally, specifically in the European cocaine trade. Cocaine has been something of a gateway drug for Western Balkans crime, but before Ndrangheta, the Calabrian mafia. Over several years now, we've seen growing production and growing supply, which today some organisations have labelled the cocaine pipeline to Europe. Important, as Stefano mentioned, that even with the pandemic and the relatively short-term disruptions to transport and logistics, the pipeline continues. Just last week, we saw massive seizures of 23 tonnes at the Hamburg and Antwerp ports. And they are just two examples of a general trend. I think what Stefano also correctly points out is that the pandemic hasn't changed the fundamental strategic logic that underlines organised crime and underlines its expansion. Ultimately, organised criminal groups continue to abuse the infrastructure, the IT, communications, the logistics and transport infrastructure of globalization, even as states continue to flirt with nationalistic, protectionist and nativist impulses. From a historical perspective, organised crime and the pipeline of cocaine into Europe is not new. We've been talking about it since the 1980s. But it's important to note that the landscape is very different from a criminal perspective. The criminal threat landscape has changed fundamentally. Today, Ndrangheta, the Calabrian mafia, is the dominant force in the European cocaine trade. And an important consideration is that it cooperates with a really vast network of criminal facilitators and brokers, not only in Europe, but also in Latin America. And there has been a general trend of moving upstream, as it's known, the movement of European criminal actors close to the source of the production, moving closer to Latin American countries involved in production and trafficking activities. Increasingly, of course, we're also seeing these organisations at the forefront of this next phase in the globalisation of crime with ever more diversified criminal portfolios. And I think there's some lessons to be learned from that perspective as well. In the intervening years, since we've been concerned about rising levels of cocaine in Europe, the organised crime threat in the EU has dispersed across the territory and intensified. And that's the crucial first point that I want to make. Take recent revelations on the extent of the spread of Ndrangheta in countries like Luxembourg and Germany, not countries we associate with deep mafia infiltration, but that's exactly what has taken place over a series of decades. And in fact, Germany is an interesting case because it evidences the first Ndrangheta coordination body in Europe. Previously, researchers like Anna Sergi have unpacked the existence of this body in far-flung places like Canada and Australia. But this suggests that Germany plays a really significant role for the Calabrian mafia and its associates right here in Europe. Even more interesting, I think we have to ask ourselves, why, after decades of revelations and investigative findings, are the German authorities so reluctant to admit they have a problem? The reason I raise Germany is it's only in recent weeks that we've seen an admission from the German federal police that Ndrangheta has deep and lasting business interests in the country. Is it a question of naivety about the risks of organised crime, or are we actually seeing a reluctance to own up to the circumstances because Germany, unlike a country like Italy, hasn't had a violent confrontation in very public view in years gone by? I think there's a reasonable concern that we actually lack a full picture of the organised crime threat in Europe, because it's not just a matter of it's not just a challenge for Western Balkans countries who are struggling to establish the rule of law and effective criminal justice institutions. Germany gives us great insight into the fact that it's also wealthy countries with strong economies, with logistical and transport infrastructure in place, that also provide enormous risks from an organised crime perspective. And I think something Virginia will touch on from an illicit financial flows perspective as well. So as we play catch up to the nature of the threat, Western Balkans groups are poised to benefit from a lot of the similar growth strategies that have allowed Ndrangheta to establish itself as perhaps the most dominant and powerful criminal organization worldwide. Western Balkans groups, such as from Albania, also benefit from dispersed diaspora communities that have been built up over many decades. Take the Albanian presence in the UK, for example, or indeed closer to home for me in Italy. There have been long-standing links between Italian mafias and groups from the Western Balkans, especially again in the context of Albanian organized crime, and so crucially, a demonstrated ability to collaborate directly with producers and brokers in Latin America. I want to talk a little bit about the key challenges from a national, regional and international perspective, which builds on the work that we've been doing at the Siracusa Institute, which recently culminated in this report, Closing the Implementation Gap. A 3-year project that has tried to support law enforcement and criminal justice actors across the broader region of Southeastern Europe. And we're really grateful for the collaboration of a number of regional bodies, including, of course, CELEC, as well as Europol and the OSCE missions in the region. I think we have to take stock of the fact that over several decades, we have seen major reforms that have really, in some ways, turned the institutional frameworks in the Western Balkans on their head. And that will require time in order for those reforms to settle and become part of daily practice. However, even with these reforms, we're seeing that the rule of law is really a very long-term project. And the crucial issue at the national level is that there is still widespread impunity for organised crime and corruption and related criminal activities. It's fair to say that the criminal justice system hasn't been able to mount much of a serious challenge to organised criminal groups and their political associates to date. This is connected to the idea of an implementation gap, that there is a significant shortfall between the legal policy and institutional frameworks that have been set in these countries and their actual practical implementation. A really crucial issue for all Western Balkans countries is it relates to information and intelligence flows, and that's directly relevant to the effectiveness of prosecutors to be able to coordinate and direct investigations. In a nutshell, Western Balkans jurisdictions are not yet making full use of the data and intelligence that is already available, and it's to do with technology, it's to do with cultural factors that inhibit the cooperation between different agencies at the national level. It's for a range of different reasons. But what it does is it prevents Western Balkans countries from developing a strategic view of the threat. And I think that it's fair to say that that strategic view is a really crucial condition precedent for effective regional and international cooperation. Regionally, we've uncovered some major gaps, and I think the COVID pandemic has shone a light on the fact that public health and security are two sides of the same coin, that organised crime is very much active in this space and that our public health systems are vulnerable. Thanks, Benjamin. So there is work that needs to be done from a legislative perspective to tackle the illicit trade in medical products. Another crucial factor is that not all Western Balkans jurisdictions are part of the same regional bodies, which means that there is an asymmetry in the information that's being shared freely between regional partners. Finally, I just want to make a quick comment about the crucial importance of elections. Elections are a typical criminal justice issue, but Montenegro, I think, gives us some insight into the power of the public vote. Very quickly, on a final note, it's not just a national and regional issue. The reality is that the global response, the UN level response to organised crime lacks teeth. It lacks teeth in respect of organised crime, whereas other global threats to peace and security have been met with a wide range of innovative, investigative, and sanctions-based tools. I think we have some questions to ask about whether or not we're deploying all of the tools at our disposal. And in fact, if there aren't those tools at the ready, let's have a discussion about how we can create them for the future. Thanks a lot, Dr. Peclini.
Thank you, Tobias, very much for these insights. So now that both you and Stefano have sort of gave us the landscape of organized crime and their deep-seated root and their ramifications at the global level, we can now turn to Virginia first, and then Valentin to give us a bit the policy perspective and the operational responses to these challenges. Virginia, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with all of you here today. Of course, I will not enter into the general panorama. Mr. Betty and Mr. Freeman have already very well explained what the situation is. But I would like to say, if there is something we can agree, is that this COVID-19 pandemic has challenged all nations in the world, including, of course, those jurisdictions in the Western Balkans. And it has shown that we weren't really prepared to put a face, to push for certain measures to be implemented. If we're talking about anti-corruption, I think the first impact shown through this pandemic is that we didn't know how to really mitigate fraud in procurement. And as Stefano well mentioned before, one of the case studies we have in the region is that occasion where in Bosnia and Herzegovina, a procurement contract was granted to a strawberry processing company, which actually, instead of buying ventilators appropriate for hospitals, they purchase ventilators that are good for the ambulances. So at the end of the day, not only there was a fraud, but the final product didn't serve for much in the occasion of this pandemic. So I think that it is safe to say that even though that in the region and else in the world, we can find many procedures that are really good, we're not so good at having in place procedures that in times of emergency have enough mitigating measures to avoid corruption. And we also need to establish measures that would ensure that there is an automatic post-facto auditing or internal oversight to ensure that corruption didn't happen, and if it happened, measures are taken forward. If we talk in general about anti-corruption and organized crime in the region, I think it's also safe to say that in comparison with other regions in the world, the Western Balkan jurisdictions are rather compliant in their laws with many anti-corruption and asset recovery measures that are proposed in international conventions. Still more needs to be done. I can identify 3 areas that if I could ask for the next Christmas what I want as a present, I would like to see in all the Western Balkan jurisdictions that illicit enrichment has been criminalized. It's a useful tool. It's not of a mandatory nature in most conventions in the world, but it's a useful tool to tackle illicit flows. On another hand, well, I have to say, for the benefit of North Macedonia, that they do have criminalized it, but my understanding it's not the case in other jurisdictions. Also, what about non-conviction-based asset forfeiture? It's only in Albania through the so-called anti-mafia law that we can find this measure, and it's a tremendous effective tool. And I will speak a little bit more about it later. So when we're talking about anti-corruption, when we're talking about organized crime, what do we want at the end of the day? What we want is to take the profit away from crime. If we don't take the profit away from crime, organized groups and corrupt persons will continue thriving and making their business. And although there are no publicly available statistics on the numbers that we have in the region in asset recovery, I would like to refer to a very recent report published by the Regional Anti-Corruption Initiative Secretariat and the IISS Center on the effectiveness of asset recovery in this region. And they have done a really good job gathering some data on recovered assets in the 6 Western Balkan jurisdictions from the last 2 years. And it's true that it's somehow happening, but not enough. The figures are low. The country where we have more asset recovery happening is Serbia. And I could read a very interesting trend, and I had never seen this before, to be frank, in my career, is that criminals here don't put the eggs in the same basket. They're really diversified, but strange enough, through the real estate investment in very small properties. 30,000 properties, small studios, small business facilities. So actually this makes the job for law enforcement and prosecutor even harder. And my kudos to those that managed to reach large numbers of recovery through very small assets. I think it's an incredible job. But still, as said, more needs to be done. Coming back to real estate properties, there is a very interesting research that was also recently published, run by the Global Initiative, that suggests that in this region, illicit financial flows function the following way. Cash culture continues being a big thing. And large amounts of cash are carried around the region in other places in Europe and from Europe to the region. The truth is that profiling in which container or which car or which traveler is traveling with big amounts of cash, it's very hard, it's very difficult. It's not as evident as you could do it with drugs or counterfeited goods. It's more subtle. Yet, the usual ways to launder these funds in the region seem to be, other than the usual misinvoicing, gambling, casinos, and life insurance, real estate. Investment to launder through real estate is huge here. And this is where, coming back to non-conviction-based asset forfeiture measures, it would be so useful if the jurisdictions in the region adopted such normative in order to implement measures that would require a lower burden of proof when trying to tackle organized crime. And I wanted to mention that before coming to the Western Balkans, I was working in Senegal, and previous to that in Latin America, based in Panama. And very interestingly, over there in Panama, in the Americas, they have over 20 years of experience with these non-conviction-based asset forfeiture measures, and which is very interesting also, given that it's a more normal measure in countries with a legal tradition of common law. In civil law countries, we don't like that measure so much. We don't know it. We're not comfortable. The truth is that in Colombia, they started applying these measures because they didn't manage to successfully prosecute and convict narcos. So instead of going through criminal procedures, they decided to implement these civil/administrative procedures by which you attack the asset, not the person. Of course, you need to have the necessary warranties so the person can claim that the asset has illicit origin. And given the success in Colombia, Guatemala followed the lead. And imagine if these measures can be successful, that in the first year of operation of the special courts on non-conviction-based asset forfeiture, they managed to seize the funds, the assets of a nefarious narco called Ponce that was never convicted through criminal procedures. And the size of the lands and properties that were seized amounted to the full Guatemala City area. This is huge, huge. And a very, very good example of what can be done through through this type of measures. So my conclusion would be that yes, in the Western Balkans, I think with what they have, more could be done. We have some really good laws in terms of asset recovery that could allow to better prosecute, convict, and seize and confiscate assets from an illicit origin. But also, we could adopt other measures that would enhance the options they have. And when we want to tackle organized crime, we want to have on the table all the measures possible at hand. What happens also is that these measures I'm putting on the table, putting on the tray now, the international conventions don't place them as mandatory measures to be adopted by all. They have an optional measure, but this doesn't mean that they're not useful. It only means that they can be more controversial. Yet, as I say, I'm asking for Christmas. My wish for the end of the year would be, please, let's have all these measures in place so we can better tackle and curb organized crime and corruption. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Virginia, for these remarks. Valentin Niculescu from SELEC, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Benjamin, and also thank you for the invitation. Dear colleagues, dear participants, I'll try to briefly for the first present ourselves a little bit, because I'm sure that not everyone knows well about SELEC. Our mission is to provide support for the member states and enhance coordination in preventing and combating transborder crime, including serious and organized crime. We are an international organization and we have 11 member states. Briefly, Albania, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Bulgaria, Hellenic Republic, Hungary, Republic of Moldova, Montenegro, Republic of North Macedonia, Romania, Republic of Serbia, and Turkey. That means that we cover a very large geographical position over here in the Southeast Europe, Western Balkans, and south of Europe. We have also, at the moment, 5 operational partners. That means Interpol, Italy, Saudi Arabia, United Kingdom, and United States. We divide our work here in SELEC in 8 task forces. That means anti-drug trafficking, anti-fraud and anti-smuggling, container security, environment and nature-related crime tasks, stolen vehicles, anti-terrorism, financial and computer crime, and countering traffic of human beings and illegal migration. And finally, with the presentation, what we do: facilitate the swift exchange of information between our member states and in the operational partners, support joint investigation and operational meetings, coordinate regional operation, produce analytical products, provide trainings, enhance the cooperation in the region, organize task force meetings, and we have a platform for networking and building trust. Some brief remarks about what the previous speakers said. The pandemic come to us in 1 year ago, March 2020. And yes, my approach, it will be a little bit more pragmatic from my operative perspective. What we observe from here, that decrease a little bit the physical, let's say, contact in the criminal organization. So less robberies, theft, etc. That the ones that are with physical contact. Increase a little bit the cybercrime. Looking back at the beginning of the pandemic area, it was a flow of the native Balkans trying to coming back to their origin countries. And the flow, it was circulating through Europe in transit. And there was the special couloirs for transit, and there was trying to get back. But the palette of the criminality in the region, it's very wide. As my previous speaker said, the drug trafficking, it's present over here. Even the border control, it was more attentive and more focused on the goods. It's present at the moment. Also, if we are looking a little bit in the history of the region, 2015, 2016, it was a very active region, and the Western Balkans route for the trafficking of the illegal migrants. Now it's decreasing a little bit, this one, as I remember Stefano said, this one. And it's also due to the, let's say, pandemic conditions. If the migrants are kept inside one territory, they must go under the pandemic rules. So they have to stay a little bit, 14 days in a quarantine. As I said, the cybercrime, it was increasing. And in a lot of countries in the region, there was reported financial fraud using the computer, phishing, also the banks, and this is in our attention. And sorry, I forgot to mention that we are law enforcement center, and in the center it's present a police officer or a border police officer and a custom officer from each member state. So we cover even the persons, even the goods. There was also some seizures at the borders with the fake medicines used for cure the COVID. Like, I don't know if I remember well, Favipir or something like this was the name of the medicine. In one of the region borders, it was an important seizure with these fake medicines. Also, now some of our colleagues are working about a network for smuggling fake vaccines. So the pandemic gave us new opportunities in this way, because in the past time we didn't know about this kind of activities, but now we are dealing with this one. Let's give at least 10 minutes to the participants for the Q&A. Thank you, Benjamin. Thank you, my colleagues.
Thank you very much, Valentin and Virginia and everyone for these remarks. If everyone agrees, we can extend by 10 minutes since we're running late, and we can give a chance for the audience to ask questions and to have some clarifications from you. I would like to stay now for a moment with both of you, Virginia and Valentin, on highlighting maybe some of the operational priorities on how to counter these rising phenomena that you mentioned, Valentin. And Virginia, perhaps you could address one of the very interesting points that Tobias mentioned on the lack of a more structured coordination at the global level. from where you sit, from UNODC. So why is criminal justice at the global level not such a priority as other agenda? Why is not on the top of the agenda? And also, if you want to address some of the other operational issues. So I'll give it to you, Virginia, first, and then Valentin for some other remarks, and then I'll have a question for Tobias and Stefan. Thank you.
Well, if you allow me, I would like to disagree a bit with Tobias on not having on the global agenda as a priority international cooperation. I think, as a matter of fact, it's on top of the agenda, but there are several issues that may actually limit the effectiveness of this coordination and cooperation. For one, it's a big world with different resources, different capacities, different laws, different legal traditions. All these make cooperation very complicated. At times, it's not evident to know who is who to cooperate. At times, there are political games at play, there are wars, there are earthquakes, there are pandemics. So none of this helps. But I believe that in the international scene, at the global level, cooperation to tackle this phenomenon, it's the big priority. And in this sense, many efforts are being carried out in terms of promoting the adoption of agreements, promoting the creation of joint operations along regions in the world, etc., etc. So maybe we could say that it could be more effective, and the ineffectiveness comes from several reasons, but it's on top of the agenda. It's very much on top of the agenda. And on suggesting maybe a policy measure for the Western Balkans, I mean, the second topic you asked me to answer, what I would like to propose, I'm sorry, I'm a little bit obsessed about the money laundering through real estate in the region, because it seems to be rampant. It's very evident. I can explain, if you want, how when I moved here to Belgrade and I was trying to find an apartment, I wanted to find something nice, impeccable, and I was shown indeed beautiful apartments. But when I asked who is the owner, they always told me it was someone who lived in southern Spain, and I don't need to explain the kind of flows that come from southern Spain to the Balkans. So I was wondering if the apartments I was being shown were actually the product of crime, and it was actually very effectively laundered. So I think with the measures that are already in place, the legal framework in place, and the resources in these jurisdictions, it could be relatively easy to state as a urgent policy matter to create interinstitutional task forces to run effective patrimonial investigations. I would involve, of course, real estate agents, notaries, the property registry, beneficial ownership registries that are starting to exist in the region, the central bank, financial intelligence units, the control and supervision organism, the tax office. And through these patrimonial investigations, many criminal procedures could be initiated. And also, when illicit enrichment is criminalized and when non-conviction-based confiscation is legislated, they would have, thank you, Benjamin, they would have the full set of measures to effectively recover the proceeds of crime. So that would be my big bet to take the profit away from crime in the region. It could probably be the easiest, the quickest, and the most evident one. Thank you.
Thank you, Virginia. Valentin, briefly, what are your two top priorities operationally?
As I said, the top priority is to enhance the operational meetings and to support the joint investigation. And in this respect, we are thinking this year for a joint operation on anti-drug trafficking, anti-fraud, anti-smuggling, container security, and environment crime tasks. Briefly, what does it mean? Operational meetings, the operative police officer or custom officer, they meet together and exchange information on a specific case. Joint investigation and joint operation. It means that all the countries in the region in a specific period of time are focusing on one of the 4 tasks that I mentioned, with the daily report on the seizure focused on this one. And briefly, one example, SALEC is involved in an international operation. The name is Opson 10, and it's coordinated by Interpol. SALEC is the regional information hub, and the focus of the operation, it's the food, fake food, starting with seeds and everything what's related to the food. This one, I can say it, the joint operation, it will be between the 2 Easters, we decided. There will be 2 weeks in April, and because we are thinking that in this period, it will be a little bit more increasing the food trafficking. Thank you, Benjamin.
Thank you, Valentin, for highlighting these 2 very concrete steps on coordination and cooperation on the part of enhanced coordination and joint investigations. I would like now to very quickly shift to the strategic and the geopolitical implications and involve back Stefano and Tobias on what are the implications in terms of the EU accession process. What are the implications in terms of the cooperation with the EU in terms of criminal justice, and how is that landscape? I'm aware about time, and I know that we could only touch the surface about this topic. Thank you. Stefano first and Tobias second. Thank you.
Thank you, Benjamin. I really try to be very, very short. I think it's really critical for Western Balkan countries to keep relying on the support of the European Union to tackle organized crime. And a lot will depend in the coming months and years on its continued engagement in promoting improvements in investigative, prosecutorial capacity, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, I mean, the fact that almost all Balkan countries are engaged in active negotiations with the EU, and that the majority of the people in the Western Balkans are fully supportive, the overwhelming majority, is fully supportive of the EU accession process, gives the EU significant clout, let's say. But my point is that this power balance that is now in favor of the European Union should not be taken for granted, right? And the EU is facing its own internal wrangling now, induced by the pandemic. And those that are familiar with EU dynamics know that an economic crisis can easily spin into a crisis of legitimacy, right? Into loss of motivation for and in even outright rejection of the European project itself. And so the waves of this would immediately be felt by the EU's closest neighbors. So to make a long story short, I think it's a very promising process that is undergoing, but also a very fragile one. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Stefano. Tobias, some reflections on these.
Thank you very much. I might try and make perhaps 2 or 3 key points. I'm glad you disagree with me, Virginia. It gives me an opportunity to clarify what I meant. The whole system of international cooperation against organized crime is premised on states assuming certain responsibilities. And we sincerely hope that signatories to these conventions abide by their responsibilities. But the reality is states don't always, can't always, aren't always switched on to the task. So my question is more of a question and perhaps an entirely new conversation. What do we do when states are unable or unwilling to tackle the problem? The answer today is we provide technical assistance and support, and that's absolutely crucial. But if we look to other types of crime with an international dimension, we'll see a veritable toolbox of measures, including sanctioning the individuals responsible. So there is no precedent at the international level for sanctions being imposed in a targeted manner on the highest level perpetrators of organised crime, in spite of the fact that organised criminals are, in a sense, professionals at manipulating illicit finance. So getting to that money is in some ways the only way we're going to prevent the further expansion of organised crime. We do it in the case of terrorism. We do it in the case of war profiteering. We do it in the case of other armed groups that exercise violence. But the difference is today we have a more sophisticated understanding of the organised crime threat. We understand it in its national and regional manifestations. But the examples I used earlier in Ndrangheta and the Albanian organised criminal group Compagnia Bello, they're not regionally focused, they're international. So unless we can tap into UN level tools that compel states to do what they say or take investigative or enforcement action in retaliation for that. I mean, I'm not suggesting this for the Western Balkans, I'm talking about a massive gap. And it's because the international legal system, as we understand it, is organised in these neatly separated boxes, but the crime doesn't reflect that scenario. A very short point on geopolitics, because for good reason, the spectre of China and Russia has been raised in the Balkans, and their interest is primarily economic. So we've got to draw a distinction. The EU is the one representing the rule of law and all of the difficult stuff, and other countries are obviously interested in the economic dimension and the geopolitical consequences that flow. One important point I want to make: we have to be careful not to ask too much of Western Balkans countries to resolve this delicate geopolitical balancing act themselves, especially when the EU at the highest level still isn't quite sure what it wants to make of China and Russia. So rather than giving conflicting information and expectations to Western Balkans countries, I think the ultimate responsibility rests on Europe to grapple with both the opportunities and the threats that these two great powers present. Of course, they're not alone in the region. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Tobias. Very, very interesting. We have a few minutes left, and we can have now questions from the audience. I have two questions in the chat, and please, in the audience, if you want to ask a question, you can raise your hand and I will give you the word. The two questions, the first one is there any evidence about the relationship between crime, organized crime, and terrorism in the Western Balkans as a result of the pandemic? And the second question, in which one of the 6 Western Balkan countries that we're talking about today, the political framework is the weakest to resist crime? So I'll ask you to jump in on what you would like to answer on these. Who wants to go first?
I'd be happy to, Benjamin, if that's okay with you.
Go ahead, of course.
My fellow panelists. I just want to mention that on the first point, not specifically crime-terror nexus, but our institute, having completed this recent PMI project, is currently looking at the connection between right-wing extremism and criminality, particularly looking at the Balkan region, where the wartime legacy that Stefano so eloquently captured still lives on, in fact, and we think it deserves a little further attention. Perhaps just a very brief comment before I hand over to my colleagues. In terms of regional cooperation is critical. I think that's been a consistent thread through all of our presentations. There is one country there is one jurisdiction that stands out, and of course it's Kosovo. Kosovo is not privy to key international conventions. It's not a member of the United Nations. It's not a member of Europol, and so on. And working arrangements have been instituted, but these are ultimately short-term solutions for what is a much longer-term strategic and security challenge for the region. Unless, and there is really promising progress, but Kosovo's status is unique, obviously, and it presents security and criminal justice challenges as a consequence.
Thank you, Tobias. Other takes on these from other panelists?
Yeah, I can say something. Completely agree with Tobias on what he said about Kosovo. In terms of one of the countries with big political issues and weaknesses in terms of fighting organized crime, I may also add Bosnia and Herzegovina. And this is because this is a very, this country has a very fragmented and duplicative, also institutional framework that reflects the very complex and delicate political community-based sort of power balances that exist in that countries. So we see that because of this huge institutional complexity and duplication of institutions, agencies, we have problems in terms of law enforcement, efficiencies, and communication, and institutional coordination. I also wanted to briefly touch on the other question about whether we have some evidence about something that they can better illuminate the nexus in organized crime and terrorism after the pandemic, or as a consequence of the pandemic. Not as far as I know. Other panelists may have some clues. I've not seen anything in this regard in and reports issued by Interpol, Europol, or other agencies in Europe, and also nothing coming from local law enforcement authorities. And this is pretty understandable, because we also know that during this pandemic time, a lot of law enforcement resources that in normal times would have been devoted to researching this type of nexus between organized crime and terrorism were deployed actually to police the lockdowns. So we were basically sent to the street. So there was really a lack also of material resources looking into these issues. But this doesn't exclude that the nexus between the two phenomena has changed because of the pandemic, but we simply do not know too much about this, unless maybe Mr. Niculescu has some information about this.
Thank you, Stefano.
Thanks.
I'll ask Valentin first, and then Virginia for just some very brief closing remarks from both of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, as Stefano said, at least for the moment, we don't have more information in this respect, because the police officers there was focused on other duties. And okay, also we don't have any results in this respect. So there was less terrorist attacks, there was less terrorists captured in the region. That means also the pandemic affect also this respect. I don't know, maybe we are trying to have an analytical product this year for 2020, the OCTA, maybe our colleagues knows about this one, and we'll put more information, analytical information in this one. Thank you very much.
Virginia.
Thank you, Benjamin. Well, on the first question posed, I don't have evidence I can rely on to answer, so I will have to leave that aside. On the second, I would like you to bear with me, but it's not a question that I'm well placed to answer. Actually, my opinion, I should keep it to myself, so bear with me on that. But thank you very much.
Well, Thank you very much to all our panelists. First, thank you very much for being with us. Thank you very much to our audience who has connected. This was a very interesting discussion, and stay tuned for next and following IISS events from the Conflict, Security and Development Program. Thank you all very much. Bye-bye.